Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. Imagine this: you're walking through the bustling streets of ancient Rome in 67 AD. The air is thick with the scent of incense and the murmur of the crowd, when suddenly, something stops you in your tracks. There, striding through the Grand Roman Forum, is Emperor Nero himself. At his side is a striking young figure, adorned in fine silk and glittering jewels. To an outsider, it might seem like the emperor is proudly showing off his new bride. But the locals know the chilling truth. That beautiful young woman was once a boy named Sporus. What happened between Nero and Sporus is not just a footnote in Roman history, it's one of the most haunting examples of power twisted into cruelty, and love distorted into control. What Nero did to Sporus stands as a disturbing chapter in the story of psychological and physical abuse that history almost forgot. Before we dive into this dark and complex tale of manipulation, loss, and identity, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you're passionate about uncovering the hidden truths of history. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. It's amazing to explore the ancient world together, connected across continents by our shared fascination with the past. This isn't just a story about Rome. It's a reflection of what happens when unchecked power reshapes grief into obsession, turns a person into a puppet of someone else's twisted fantasy. The name Sporus might not be familiar to you, but his story will haunt you long after you finish listening. Let's start with the man who would Beckham, the architect of this tragedy. Nero wasn't born evil. In fact, his early reign showed remarkable promise. When he ascended to the throne at just 16 years old, many Romans believed they were witnessing the dawn of a golden age. He reduced taxes, funded public entertainment, and even performed in theatrical productions that delighted common people. But absolute power has a way of corrupting even the most promising souls, and by 65 AD, something had fundamentally broken inside the emperor's mind. Maybe it was the constant paranoia that comes with no ingevera around you once your position. Maybe it was the isolation of being the only person in an empire of 60 million who could never be contradicted, never backlend, never be told they were wrong. Or maybe it was what happened to the one person he claimed to love more than life itself. Her name was Papaya. Sabina Ange was everything Nero thought he wanted in a woman, beautiful beyond description, intelligent enough to make his own grandiose vision of himself, and ambitious enough to share his dreams of eternal glory. But Papia wasn't just another pretty face in the imperial court. She possessed the kind of sharp political instincts that made her a formidable ally or a dangerous enemy. When Nero first laid eyes on Papia, he was already married to Octavia, Theditor of the previous emperor. It had been a cold, loveless political marriage. Papia represented everything that Octavia was not. Where Octavia was quiet and reserved, Papia was vivacious and commanding. Where Octavia sought to avoid attention, Papia reveled in being the center of everyone's gaze. The affair between Nero and Papia began as a typical Roman scandal. But what started as adultery quickly evolved into something much more dangerous: genuine obsession. Nero wasn't just attracted to Pompey's beauty, he was consumed by her in a way that terrified even his closest advisors. Ancient historians describe Nero's behavior during this period as increasingly erratic and possessive. He would fly into murderous rages if other men so much as looked at Papia too long. During public functions, he begged guards around her at all times, ostensibly for protection, but really to monitor her every interaction. He lavished her with gifts that bankrupted the imperial treasury: jewels from India, silks from China, perfumes from Arabia, but perhaps most tellingly, began to reshape reality itself to accommodate his obsession. First, he divorced Octavia, a shocking move that alienated many supporters. Then he announced his intention to marry Papia in a full imperial ceremony. The wedding was a spectacle of unprecedented luxury, with Nero sparing no expense to demonstrate this devotion. Even marriage couldn't satisfy Nero's need to possess Poa completely. He began to isolate her from family and friends, surrounding her with people who owed their positions entirely to his favor. He commissioned dozens of portraits and sculptures of her, not just for public display, but for his private chambers, so he could look upon her image even when they were apart. Ancient sources tell us that Nero would sometimes spend hours simply watching Poa as she went about her daily activities. This wasn't romantic devotion, was the behavior of someone who had confused love with ownership, who saw wanted a human being not as an independent person but as a beautiful object that existed solely for his pleasure. Puya, for her part, seemed to understand the dangerous game she was playing. She was intelligent enough to recognize that her beauty and Nero's obsession gave her unprecedented power, but also shrewd enough to realize this power came with risks. She began using her influence to advance her family's interests, building a network of supporters who would protect her if Nero's affections ever wavered. Papapia had one fatal flaw. She wasn't afraid to stand up to Nero. Unlike Avrion, Elson, the imperial court, Hohat, learned to anticipate the emperor's moods. Papia retained her independence of spirit. She would argue with him about policy decisions, criticize his artistic exercise, and even mock his performance when she thought they were subpar. The details of what happened on that fateful day in 65 AD vary depending on which ancient historian you believe, but the outcome was always the same. During what started as a typical domestic argument, some sources say about Nero coming home late from chariot races, others about his theatrical pursuits. The emperor lost control in a way that would haunt him forever. According to Tacitus, the argument escalated when Papia dared to criticize Nero's priority, suggesting he cared more about his image than his responsibility as a husband and father. She was pregnant at the time, carrying what would have been their second child, and perhaps Thestrus made her less willing to tolerate Nero's increasingly erratic behavior. What happened next has been debated by historians for centuries, but consensus is that Nero, in a fit of rage, either kicked or struck his pregnant wife with such brutal force that she suffered fatal internal injuries. Some sources suggest it was a single blow to her abdomen. Others describe a sustained attack that left her bleeding and unconscious on the marble floor. Imagine the moment when Nero realized what he had done. The manual commanded 30 legions who could have Anion executed with a word, who was worshipped as a god. In eastern province had just destroyed the one thing he actually cared about. The woman he had obsessed over was dying because of his own uncontrolled violence. Ancient sources describe the scene that followed as one of the most pathetic in imperial history. Nero reportedly threw himself on Papia's body, alternately begging her forgiveness and commanding her to live as if his imperial authority extended even over death itself. He summoned the best physicians in Rome, offering them fortunes to save her life, threatening them with torture if they failed. But it was too late. Poya did within hours, taking with her the unborn child who might have been Neroshir. In that moment, something fundamental broke inside the emperor's mind. The grief that followed wasn't just emotional devastation, it was a complete break with reality. Nero's mourning became legendary. He refused to have property as body burned according to Roman custom, instead having it embalmed and placed in a tomb more elaborate than those of previous emperors. He declared her divine, established a cult in her honor, and spent days talking to her corpse as if she could still hear him. The imperial court now had 2 navigation. Even more treacherous landscape courtiers were expected to participate in the fiction that Papia was somehow still alive, referring to her in present tense, and leaving her favorite seat empty at banquets. Anyone who suggested the emperor should move on was immediately exiled, or worse. It was during this period that first entered Nero's line of sight. The young man had no idea he was walking Dento, a nightmare. Sporus was probably Orin 14 or 15, born into slavery in the imperial household and freed as a child. He had been raised within the palace walls, receiving education that prepared him for administrative duties. This was actually a position of relative privilege. Freedmen in imperial service often enjoyed better conditions than freeborn citizens of lower classes, but this privilege came with compulsory dependence on imperial favor. Freedmen owed everything to their former master's generosity, creating absolute availability. They could be elevated to great influence, but also discarded, punished, or killed on a whim with no legal recourse. What made Sporus special in Nero's eyes wasn't his intelligence or skills, it was his face. Multiple ancient sources agree that the young man bore an uncanny resemblance to Dead Papoa, particularly around the eyes and delicate bone structure. In a world where Romans believed physical spells indicated deeper spiritual connection, this similarity would have seemed almost supernatural. The first time Nero saw Sporus after Poppaea's death, something clicked in the emperor's broken mind. Here was a chance to undo the irreversible, to bring back what he had destroyed. Their resemblance was so striking that for a moment, Nero may have actually believed was seeing Poppaea's spirit return it in a new form. Of course, there was only obvious problem. Sporus was male, but for a man who had convinced himself he was a god who had spent months talking to a corpse, changing someone's gender seemed like a minor obstacle. What happened next represents one of the most calculatics of cruelty in human history. Nero didn't just decide to force Sporus to dress as a woman, he decided to make the transformation permanent. The emperor summoned the best physicians in Rome and ordered them to perform surgery on the young man, purely to make him appear more feminine. This wasn't just mutilation, it was systematic destruction of Sporus' identity as a human being. The procedure was dangerous, painful, and irreversible, resulting in death from infection or blood loss. But even if Sporus survived, he would be forever changed, physically, emotionally, and socially. Old, never father children, never normal relationships, never even be considered fully male by Roman society. The surgery took place in the imperial palace, in quarters specifically prepared for the purpose. Ancient surgical procedures were primitive, relying on basic instruments and crude anesthetics. The process would have been excruciating, lasting hours with significant risk of death. Sporus would have been held down by guards while a physician approached with their instruments, knowing his screams would fall on deaf ears. Once Sporus recovered, a process taking weeks or months, Nero announced something that shocked even jaded Roman aristocrats. He was going to marry the young man in a full ceremony. The preparations took months and consumed enormous resources. Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, after the dead empress, and moved to special quarters where he could be prepared for his new role. Imperial seamstresses created an entire wardrobe, designing gowns that would flatter his modified physique and hide remaining masculine characteristics. Master jewelers crafted ornaments specifically for him, incorporating gems that had once belonged to Pompeia herself. These weren't just accessories, they were tangiblings to the dead woman, physical reminders of the person Sporus was being forced to replace. Makeup artists taught them cosmetic techniques to feminize his features. They showed him how to use colto, make his eyes appear larger, how to apply rouge for rosy cheeks, how to use powders to soften facial angles. These lessons weren't just about appearance, they were exercises in systematic erasure of his original identity. Hairdressers instruct him in elaborate styling techniques fashionable among aristocratic Roman women. His hair was cut, curled, and arranged in complex patterns, often incorporating expensive ornaments. The process could take hours daily, requiring multiple servants and heated metal tools, but perhaps most were lessons in feminine behavior and deportment. Sporus was assigned tutors who taught him how to walk, sit, and gesture in appropriately ladely ways. He learned how to hold his position, his feet, arrange his clothing when seated, and move through conveying grace rather than masculine strength. Voice coaches worked with him to modify his speech patterns, chinging him to speak in higher tones, and adopt linguistic manners maciate with feminine discourse. This was perhaps the most challenging aspect, as vocal patterns are deeply ingrained and difficult to change consciously. Can you imagine the psychological torture of this transformation? If Sporus was forced to look in mirrors, reflecting back a stranger wearing his face every lesson. In feminine behavior reminded him that his identity was being systematically erased. Every piece of jewelry that had unseated a dead woman was now a shackle binding him to a role he never chose. Voting was scheduled for spring 67, at time to coincide with religious festivals that would add ceremonial weight. Nero spared no expense, treating Jit as a legitimate imperial wedding worthy of the greatest emperor in Roman history. The ceremony took place in Thelurges Palace Hall, decorated with flowers and illuminated sands of oil lamps. Musicians played traditional wedding songs while bands offered finest wines and delicacies. Outside observers who didn't know Thethel's story, it might have looked like a normal imperial wedding. But those in Thano understood they were witnessing something unprecedented and disturbing. Here was the most powerful man in Thorold, publicly marrying a surgical modified teenage boy, dressed as his dead wife. The ceremony included all Roman rituals, exchanging vows, joining hands, sharing sacred bread, signing legal documents, making this union official. The guests played their parts with accomplished acting skills, offering congratulations and expensive gifts, while maintaining appropriate joy. But the atmosphere must have been thick with barely concealed horror, fascination, and nervous energy that comes from participating in something fundamental. Following the wedding, Nero treated Sporus exactly as he would a The young man received his own household staff quarters within Thepales complex, and income from the imperial treasury. He had his own litter for traveling horses for riding, and retinue of supporters. But all this apparent luxury came with a terrible, complete eraser of his original identity and constant performance of a psychologically devastating role. Sporus was expected to accompany Nero to public functions, sit beside him at stated dinners, and play the devoted wife in all interactions. This wasn't just a boot appearances. Nero genuinely seemed to believe he had successfully resurrected Toba. He would call Sporus by his dead wife's name, reminisce about rodmeries that had never happened, and expect responses, maintaining the elaborate fiction. For Sporus, every day became a high-stakes performance, where the slightest mistake could mean death. He had to remember not just how to look and act like a woman, but how to respond as if he were popular herself. When Nero mentioned events from his previous, Sporus had to react as if he remembered them personally. Ancient sources describe Sporus as becomingensizingly skilled at this deception, developing an almost supernatural ability to anticipate Nero's moods and respond appropriately. But he grew more withdrawn and melancholic as time passed, though he continued playing his assigned role perfectly. In public, the psychological strain is almost impossible to imagine. Every morning Sporus woke in rooms decorated to remind him of a dead woman had never met. Every mirror reflection bore no resemblance to his original appearance. Every conversation required prodding to be someone else, having memories and experiences that weren't his own. For over 2 years Sporus lived this bizarre existence. But his ordeal reached new heights when Nero decided to tour Greece. The emperor fancied himself an artist and was eager to compete in Greek festivals where he believed his would be properly appreciated. Naturally, Sporus accompanied him, displayed to foreign dignitaries, as theme press of Rome imagine Greek aristocrats trying to make sense of their conqueror traveling with a teenage boy dressed as a woman. Treat this obvious fiction as reality. But by 68 AD, Nero's sexes had finally pushed the Roman establishment too far. Rebellions broke out across the empire, led by governors tired of the emperor's erratic behavior and neglect of governance. The Taurian declared opposition to Nero's contemned rule, and the Senate condemned him as an enemy of the state. When Nero finally fled Rome with a small group of supporters, Sporus was among them, even facing death. The emperor couldn't leave behind his living reminder of Poierathi, holed up in a villa outside Rome waiting for either rescue or capture. While Nero alternated between grandiose escape plans and theatrical preparations for suicide, When word came that enemies were closing in, Nero finally chose Detover capture, but his suicide left Sporus incredibly vulnerable as one of the most visible symbols of Nero's reign. He was both a valuable prize and dangerous liability for whoever claimed power next. What followed was perhaps even more tragic. Sporus became a political pawn passed from one powerful man to another like valuable property, first claimed by Nedius Sabinus, then by Uo, then by Vitellius, each treating him much as Nerehad, keeping him dressed as a woman, and calling him by Poia's name. It was under Vitellius that Sporus' nightmare reached its ultimate conclusion. The new emperor decided to use him for public eternity in the Coliseum Piscically, in a reenactment of mythological scenes involving violence and humiliation for Sporus. This represented the ultimate degradation, being sexually humiliated in front of thousands for their amusement. Rather than submit to this final humiliation, Sporus made the only choice that wasterly his own. In years he took his own life, probably by poison, sometime in 69 AD. He was probably no more than 20 years old in death. Sporus finally escaped the grotesque theater that had consumed his life. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the human cost of imperial excess. But ancient historians seemed less interested in Sporus as a person than Asa, symbol of imperial decadence. What makes his story so haunting isn't just Asa, abuse he endured, but how he was systematically stripped of identity and agency. From the moment Nero decided Heres Papia, Sporus ceased to exist as an individual and became instead a canvas for the emperor's twisted fantasies. The fact that Sporus chose death over further humiliation suggests that, somewhere beneath the layers of forced femininity and imperial conditioning, some spark of his original self survived. His suicide was Bothridge D. and final act of defiance, a refusal to be degraded further, even at the cost of his life. Perhaps most tragically, we know almost nothing about what Sporus was before his transformation. What were his hopes and dreams? What did I want to do with his life? All of that was erased when he became Nero's living doll, replaced by a performance so complete that his original identity disappeared entirely. The boy who was forced to become an empress, who endured years of psychological and physical abuse, who finally chose death over further degradation. His story deserves to be remembered not just as a curiosity from ancient Rome, but as a testament to both human cruelty and human resilience in choosing his own death. Sporus reclaimed the one thing denied him throughout his adult life, the power to make his own choice about his fate. History reminds us that behind every historical narrative of imperial grandeur, there are individual humans suffering and survival that deserve our attention and our compassion. Even across the vast gulf of 2,000 years,